10 minutes later, the two men were sitting in front of a small table in the back of the store, coffee mugs bearing the name of the bookstore, expelling the steaming aroma of a shopping warehouse clubhouse blend. "So you didn't lock the door." Thomas laughed. "I've read my share of science fiction." He waved a hand to indicate their surroundings. Asimov, Heinlein, Simmons. The key word might be fiction, but I can understand how it's easy to explain some of the weird things that happen in life away with some of the more entertaining theories out there. "But this is not just a theory. You yourself wrote BerenstEin. If I came here and said, 'America is supposed to still be under English rule,' I'd understand outright skepticism. But you own a bookstore and you still wrote BerenstEin. I think that's the reason you didn't lock the door on me." "I think that's the reason that I didn't lock the door is because I'm not a jerk, and I don't mind the company, to be honest. I also think the reason I didn't notice the BerenstEin name all these years is that I just didn't look closely. Probably a couple of loud children were around when people were buying those books, or maybe I'm right and they just changed it recently." John indicated a large accordion folder he had brought in from the car. "I have the Google search results in here, but why don't you do it for yourself?" He nodded at the laptop that was on the small table. "Okay, I'll indulge." Thomas opened his browser and typed into the search bar, "When did the Berenstein Bears become the Berenstain Bears?" He hit enter, and immediately his eyes saw the first few results. He chuckled. "Well, at least you're not alone." The first few results were sites and blogs dedicated to the idea that the Berenstain Bears were proof that the Earth was now in an alternate reality that was able to be perceived by millions of people living in it. There were a couple of YouTube videos relating to the same topic. Let's see how many pages of results I have to get through until we get an answer. He searched page 2 and then page 3. By the bottom of page 2, there were no sites talking about the name change. Let's try a different way. "You're wasting your time. I've tried every search possible. Berenstain, BerenstEin, BerenstEin, Berenstain. Name change BerenstEin. Name change Berenstain. And 100 other unique search strings. There is no indication on the web officially that it was ever anything other than the Berenstain Bears." Officially? Type Berenstein into eBay. Thomas opened a new tab and did a suggestion. "Okay, the picture of the first few books clearly say Berenstain." "And the product descriptions say?" John prompted. "BerenstEin, the Berenstain Bears," all the way down the page, 15. Thomas clicked to the next page. "Here's one Berenstain, but all the others are BerenstEin." "Hundreds!" John exclaimed triumphantly. "Hundreds of listings, where the picture of the book clearly says Berenstain, yet the memory is so ingrained and real in the listing seller's mind that in each case they wrote the wrong for this reality spelling, even though they had the book right in front of their faces." Thomas noticed that John was breathing heavily again as he talked. He admitted to himself that it was an interesting anomaly. He closed his eyes and imagined the familiar logo of the children's book. He could see it clearly, the Berenstain Bears. "I'll admit it's interesting. I can't explain it, but there is probably a logical explanation for it." "Name one," John challenged. Thomas took a sip from the now cooling coffee. "Okay. These are books we read as children. Or, more often than not, had them read to us, right?" John nodded his agreement. "So as kids, are we really paying attention to how the long last name of these bears is spelled?" "Come on, you gotta do better than that," John countered. "That might explain how people might spell it wrong years later, but spell it wrong in the exact same way." "Well, look at the name as it is on these books." Thomas took on the air of a lecturer. "The Berenstain Bears. THEBEREN Stain Bears. The only part of the entire phrase that doesn't have an E is the part that you say everyone keeps getting wrong." "But that doesn't explain why," John started. "But we were all little kids when we were exposed to these books. Maybe we took one look at the title, saw all those E's, and our little minds just filled in the rest with E's. I doubt we were sounding out the name at 3 or 4 years old. We didn't read it that way, we just thought we did. And the memory of the word we perceived just stuck in our minds. Until we noticed the real spelling, or in my case, had it pointed out to me by you. Thomas waited for what he figured would be a rebuttal. He was enjoying the discourse. John countered. Do you remember your parents or your teachers or whoever was reading the book to you saying, BerenstEin? Stain is a distinct sound. It's the kind of thing that little kids would laugh and make little jokes about. Most people clearly remember the sound Steen or Stein. Both would be how BerenstEin might be pronounced, not BerenstEin. Thomas smiled. That's a fair argument. You're right. I'll admit even now the correct pronunciation, BerenstEin, sounds downright foreign. The thing is, we're talking about for us, what, 25, 30 years ago? I can't remember what I ate for breakfast last week, so my mind probably remembers the way I thought it was spelled, and that's just the way I now remember hearing it in my head. He shook his head. That's the problem when we try to talk about the past. You and I may have a different memory of this conversation next month. You might swear that I had the blue mug and you had the red, when I clearly remember the opposite. John picked up the red mug that was right in front of him. The Mandela Effect. What is the Mandela Effect? Now it was John's turn to lecture. Your example with the mugs was a good one to explain the little discrepancies in how people remember little details differently. Siblings years later will remember sitting on opposite sides of a car during a road trip, for example. 20 years later, elementary school classmates will remember classroom details differently. These are always chalked up to the passage of time, and besides, since there are so few people involved, no one ever thinks of these anomalies as anything other than misremembered minutiae. Since the explosion of the internet, though, our ability to communicate with others is so radically different than just 20 years ago. It's almost an evolutionary change. So when events have happened that people remember differently later on, it's much easier to find others who remember them the same way. And one of these events that people remember differently is the death of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela? He died recently, right? I remember the guy who crashed the funeral and was pretending to be a sign language interpreter during President Obama's speech. Thomas laughed at the memory of the man gesticulating on stage. What if I told you that about 15% of people who are old enough to remember would swear that they have a clear memory of Nelson Mandela dying in prison sometime during the 1980s? Well, that's preposterous. To you, that may be. To me, if I'm being honest, I don't remember Mandela dying during the 1980s. But why do so many people have a clear memory of it? There are people who remember the news accounts and teachers talking about it the next day. Thomas searched his memory for a name. Steve Biko? Biko. He was another South American activist who died in the late 1970s in prison. Whenever we studied apartheid, I'm sure one man's name came up when the other ones did. We're talking about memories from so long ago. Maybe, John conceded. Or maybe we really are living in just one timeline out of an infinity of others that exist alongside each other. Thomas didn't speak for a moment. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so engaged in a conversation. He didn't have many friends, and those he did occasionally hang out with were always talking about their children and complaining about their jobs. I am open to the idea that there are multiple timelines. I mean, quantum physics, which I'm no expert in, I think has a theory that every time in any reality there's more than one action that can be taken, an alternate reality or timeline exists so that every quantum possibility occurs. That's at least my understanding of what I've read in science fiction. He chose his next words carefully. But even if there was one reality where the name was BerenstEin, and another where the name was BerenstEin, and another where it's the Smiths Bears, how could anyone have a memory of the one in the reality that they do not exist in? Quantum suicide. John let the phrase hang in the air. Quantum suicide? Have you ever heard of the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment? Thomas shrugged. It sounds familiar. I know I've seen it in sci-fi. Well, I'll give you the short version. There's a theory in quantum physics that atoms and other particles exist in what are called superpositions, that they exist in multiple states corresponding to different outcomes until they interact with the world or are observed. Then they collapse into a single state. Do you follow? Not really, but enough. Alright, imagine an atom as a bullet. It can be fired or not fired, and it can hit its target and not hit its target. Well, until the decision is made to either fire the bullet or not, or the atom, there exists at least three possibilities. One, that the bullet remains in the chamber of the gun. Two, that the bullet was fired and has hit its target. And three, that the bullet was fired and missed the target. Thomas finished. I get that. What I also get from what you're saying is that in the theory that if there's an infinite amount of universes or realities, or all three of these possibilities actually happen, right. So in the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment, the idea is that if you locked a cat in a box with a poison gas pill that had a 50% chance of releasing the gas, Thomas finished, then the cat would be both dead and alive? Right. Until the box was open and the results, cat dead or cat alive, were observed, the cat would exist in both states. Once the box was open, in theory, both states would collapse into one, and to the observer, it would seem as if there was only ever one state. You'd either have a cat that was alive and well, or you'd have a dead cat. Thomas laughed. I was about to say makes sense, but I think it's giving me a headache. John nodded. It's a lot to wrap your mind around. Drink some more coffee because I'm about to take you even further down the rabbit hole with me. So, if only one reality exists, then that cat is either dead or it's alive, right? He said. According to what I understand about all of this, yes. So what if you're the cat? Thomas was starting to see where this was leading. John continued. If you're the cat, you can't observe your own death. So the only reality you could be aware of is the one where the poison pill didn't release its gas. John wheezed a bit on the last word. So quantum suicide is...